3 true scary stories from Reddit. Reddit's haunting urban legends you won't believe. It was just a casual evening when I found myself scrolling through Reddit, aimlessly searching for something to fill the quiet hours of the night. I was far from a horror fanatic. My interests lay more in science fiction and occasional deep dives into conspiracy theories, but something about the thread titled True Scary Stories, Urban Legends from Reddit caught my eye. Maybe it was the title, or maybe it was the strange sense of boredom creeping over me, but I clicked. At first, I was skeptical. Reddit, after all, was a place where everyone had a story to tell, and not all of them were worth the attention. But as I skimmed through the thread, I realized something. These stories weren't like the typical internet creepypasta. They were detailed, personal. Many of them included real names, exact locations, and references to events that seemed far too real to be made up. Some of the posts even claimed to have pictures, although they looked like nothing more than blurry shapes or grainy shadows. The first story I read was about an abandoned house in a small town, said to be haunted by the ghost of a child who died in a fire years ago. According to the poster, the house had been empty for decades, but anyone who dared enter could hear the sound of small footsteps echoing from the walls. Most people dismissed it as an urban legend, but this particular poster swore that the sounds were real, and he could prove it. I frowned, skepticism kicking in. Could it be true? A part of me wanted to laugh it off, but the more I read, the more a chill crept down my spine. I pushed back from the desk, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling settling over me. But something about that story stuck. I found myself searching for more. Each story seemed to carry the same eerie tone. First-hand accounts of strange events and terrifying encounters. Stories of people who wandered too far into the unknown and came back, changed. One story spoke of a haunted hospital where patients had mysteriously vanished from their beds overnight. Another told of an old man who, after years of silence, confessed to a murder he didn't commit, only to be found dead the next day, his body untouched, his eyes wide open in fear. The more I read, the more I felt like I was sinking deeper into something darker. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, reminding me how much time I'd already spent on this thread. It was well past midnight now. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of my computer and the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath me. A strange sensation crawled up my spine. I glanced at the empty space beside me, as if expecting someone or something to appear. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling, but it lingered, settling in my gut. Could these stories be real? And if so, what would happen if I kept digging? I leaned forward, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The urge to keep reading, to unravel the mysteries these stories promised, was growing stronger by the second. Yet, another thought gnawed at me. How far am I willing to go? This was no longer just idle curiosity. There was something about these stories that felt connected. The more I read, the more it seemed as though the boundaries between the online tales and the real world were beginning to blur. What was once just a story on a screen was now creeping into my thoughts, filling my mind with unsettling questions. And as I clicked on the next story, I had no idea that I was about to begin a journey that would lead me to the darkest corners of the internet, and to places I never should have ventured. Story 1. The Haunted Basement. A Reddit user's dark discovery. It all started with the move. I had just graduated college and landed a small but decent apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't anything extravagant, but the rent was affordable, and the area seemed peaceful enough. The kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened, or at least that's what I thought when I signed the lease. The complex was old, built in the 1960s, but it had a certain charm, with its weathered brick exterior and ivy creeping up the sides. My apartment was small but cozy, tucked in the back corner of the building, away from the noise of the street. But from the very first night, something felt off. At first, I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of being in a new place, the strange creaks of old wood settling, the usual noises a new apartment would make. Yet the noises didn't stop after the first night. At first, it was faint, just the softest shuffle of footsteps echoing through the thin walls. I figured it was just the other tenants moving about. But then they began to change. By the second week, the noises came every night, growing louder and more distinct. Dragging sounds, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, followed by an eerie silence. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to investigate. One evening, after hearing the scraping sound again, I decided to take a walk through the building. The halls were dim, lit only by flickering fluorescent lights that hummed like ghosts of the past. The building's old structure made everything feel like it was about to fall apart. But there was something else, something that gnawed at my gut as I passed each door, each corner. It was as if the building itself was holding something back, something waiting to be discovered. I walked past the maintenance closet and down a narrow hallway I had never noticed before. It was tucked at the far end of the building, hidden behind a stack of old and used furniture. It looked like the entrance to a storage room, but as I approached, I noticed something strange, a heavy metal door, half obscured by a pile of old boxes. My curiosity took over. Without a second thought, I moved the boxes and reached for the rusty handle. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs leading downward into darkness. It was the basement. I had never heard anyone mention a basement in this building, and there was no sign of it anywhere on the floor plans I had seen when I moved in. My pulse quickened. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I hesitated, the air thick with the scent of dampness and decay. I stared into the dark space below, unsure of what to expect. Something tugged at me, a strange, unexplainable pull that urged me to go down there, to explore. I descended slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. The air grew colder the further down I went, and I felt a chill crawl over my skin. The stairs opened into a wide, empty room. It was cavernous but oddly claustrophobic at the same time. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, stained from years of neglect. Dust hung thick in the air, caught in the beam of my flashlight, creating an eerie glow. The room was filled with remnants of forgotten lives, old furniture, boxes of discarded belongings, and crumpled sheets of paper. But what struck me most was the photos on the walls. Dozens of them, some framed, some just pinned to the peeling wallpaper, were scattered throughout the basement. They were all black and white pictures, faded, fraying at the edges. Most of the faces in the photos were obscured by time, their features blurry, as though they had been captured in an era long gone. Some showed children playing in old-fashioned clothing. Others were portraits of families standing together, stiff and formal. But there was something unsettling about them. They seemed to stare at me. No, they watched me with lifeless eyes. The more I looked, the more I felt as though the basement itself was breathing around me, a dark presence that had been lying dormant for years. I moved deeper into the basement, my flashlight flickering against the walls. The further I walked, the more it felt like the air was pressing in on me. The room seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the heavy silence wrapped itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling at the back of my mind, the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was the only one in the basement. Then I noticed something odd. There in the corner behind an old wardrobe was another door. This one was smaller, almost hidden, as if it didn't want to be found. My curiosity got the best of me, and I moved toward it, carefully pushing the wardrobe aside. As I reached for the doorknob, I felt the air shift around me, a cold, biting draft that made my skin prickle. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing a narrow hallway leading even deeper into the basement. I knew I should have turned back. Something about the darkness beyond that door felt wrong, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to make a decision. But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped through the door, and as I did, the faintest whisper seemed to fill the air. So soft, so fleeting, that I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination. I wasn't alone down there. Something had been waiting for me. Over the next few days, I couldn't get the basement out of my mind. I found myself returning to it again and again, unable to resist the pull of that strange, suffocating place. Each visit made me feel more and more like I was being drawn into something I couldn't quite comprehend. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, the whispers, the flickering shadows in my peripheral vision. But soon, it became clear that something was very wrong. It started with the whispers. They weren't loud, not at first. In fact, they were so soft, so subtle, that I almost convinced myself I was hearing things. But the longer I stayed in that basement, the more distinct the voices became. They weren't words, not exactly, but sounds, hushed murmurs, like a conversation just out of reach. Every time I tried to focus on them, they would stop, only to start again the moment my attention wandered. Then there were the shadows, always fleeting, always just beyond my vision. I would catch the briefest glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't the flicker of a flashlight or the shift of the dust motes in the air. These were solid, dark shapes that darted from one corner of the room to the other, vanishing before I could fully turn my head. I began to feel like I wasn't alone down there, like there were other eyes watching me, following my every move. I tried to dismiss it all. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, the basement was old, the house was creaky, and the place had a strange energy to it. The more I explored, the more I realized I wasn't just imagining things. One night, I found a small, old book buried under a pile of discarded papers in the back of the basement. It was weathered, the edges of the pages torn and yellowed with age. The cover was plain, but the weight of it in my hands felt unnerving, like I had just uncovered something long forgotten, something better left undisturbed. I opened it, flipping through the brittle pages until I came across an entry that stopped me dead in my tracks. The words were hard to read, faded and smudged, but one sentence jumped out at me like a warning. The basement was the last place they saw the light of day. I read the words over and over again, feeling a chill creep down my spine. The more I dug into the book, the more disturbing it became. It wasn't just a journal, it was a record. The basement had been used for something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The pages spoke of a local cult, one that had once operated in the area years ago, a group that had been known for their twisted rituals and sacrifices. According to the book, the basement had served as a holding cell for their victims, people who had been abducted, tortured, and left to die in the darkness beneath the apartment complex. The details were horrifying. There were mentions of screams, of blood-soaked floors, and whispers in the night. The more I read, the more it felt like I was uncovering a secret that should have been left buried. This wasn't just a forgotten chapter in the history of the building. It was something far more sinister. The victims, it seemed, were never truly gone. Their energy, their suffering, it had seeped into the walls of that basement, leaving behind an oppressive presence that refused to rest. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know more. The next time I visited the basement, I felt it more acutely than ever before. The weight of the place, the sense of something watching me from the shadows. The whispers were louder now, almost taunting. I felt their presence like a physical force, pushing me deeper into the room. As I moved further into the basement, I noticed the temperature had dropped. My breath was visible in the air, swirling in front of me in small, foggy clouds. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I suddenly felt trapped. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, where the basement seemed to extend into another darkened hallway, something moved. A shadow, tall and thin, creeping along the wall. I froze, unable to breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out. Nothing. I waited, straining my ears to hear any sound, but the room was silent. I took a hesitant step forward, but before I could take another, a cold draft swept through the basement, carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. It was overwhelming, like something dead and rotting, like the earth itself had been disturbed after centuries of stillness. I turned to leave, to run, but as I took a step back toward the stairs, I heard them. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me from behind. My breath caught in my throat as I whipped around, half expecting to see someone standing in the dark. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. The basement stretched on, silent and cold, the shadows undisturbed. Still, the footsteps echoed in my ears, growing louder, closer. Thud, thud, thud. I backed up toward the stairs, my hands trembling. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't see anything, but the sound of those footsteps was undeniable. I turned to run up the stairs, but as I did, the air around me thickened. My legs felt heavy, as though the very weight of the basement was dragging me down. I reached the top of the stairs, but as I fled out of the basement and into the hallway, I looked over my shoulder once more, expecting to find someone or something right behind me. There was nothing, except the lingering smell of decay, clinging to the air, hanging in the space between each breath I took. I didn't go back to the basement after that, and I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't stop myself. I had uncovered something terrible, something that had been buried for far too long. The basement was not just a place of forgotten memories. It was a prison, a place where the darkness of the past had come alive, a place where something unseen still waited for its next victim. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to leave, but I couldn't help but wonder, was I the last to discover the truth? Or had someone been waiting for me, just like all the others before me? Story 2. The stranger who wasn't really there. I first noticed him on a Tuesday morning, though I couldn't remember exactly when he arrived. It was one of those things where his presence seemed to creep into the fabric of the town without anyone acknowledging it. At first, he was just a man, a stranger, nothing more. But soon, his eerie behavior began to unsettle me. He appeared out of nowhere, blending in with the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I saw him standing at the edge of the crowd outside the local cafe, just watching. No one spoke to him, and he didn't speak to anyone either. He just stood there, unnervingly still, his gaze fixed on the activity around him, like an observer who wasn't supposed to be there. His clothes were ordinary, dark jacket, unremarkable jeans, and a pair of boots that looked just a bit too new. There was nothing about him that screamed stranger, except for the way he seemed so out of place. At first, I thought nothing of it. People come and go in small towns like ours. A traveler, a tourist passing through, maybe, but then I saw him again and again. The man would appear in different places, always hanging back in the shadows of the crowd, but never engaging. Once, I saw him standing in the corner of the grocery store, silently staring at the cereal boxes. He wasn't shopping, he wasn't doing anything really, just standing there. The other customers walked by him, none of them even noticing his presence. I couldn't stop staring at him. Something about the way he stood, motionless, with a distant look in his eyes, gave me the chills. I turned to the cashier to ask if she had noticed the man. She looked at me blankly for a moment, as if she was struggling to recall him. Then, almost as if the thought slipped away, she just shrugged and said, "I didn't see anyone." That struck me as odd. I glanced over at the man again, and he was still there, unmoving. But when I asked the people around me, nobody seemed to remember him either. The older woman by the bread aisle couldn't recall seeing anyone, and neither could the young father with his toddler by the dairy section. I started to question myself. Was I imagining things? Maybe he was just another stranger who didn't speak to anyone and blended into the background. But no, it wasn't just that. There was something distinctly off about him. It wasn't that people didn't notice him. It was that they didn't remember him. It was as though he existed in some kind of in-between space, a person but not really there. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing my grip on reality. My encounters with him became more frequent. He'd stand at the bus stop but never get on a bus. He'd wander down the street in front of the diner, his gaze always distant, as if he wasn't part of the world around him. But whenever I tried to approach him or even ask someone nearby if they knew who he was, it was always the same response. Blank stares, confusion, and then quickly turning away. I asked my friend Becky about him one evening when we were having drinks at the local bar. "Have you noticed that guy?" I asked, lowering my voice so no one else could hear. "The one who's always hanging around, but never talking to anyone?" She looked at me, puzzled. "What guy?" "The one at the cafe, the grocery store, the diner, always lurking around. He just stands there. Don't you think that's kind of weird?" Becky stared at me, as if I'd said something ridiculous. She laughed softly and shrugged. "I don't know who you're talking about, but if you say so." My blood ran cold. I could have sworn I wasn't imagining it. But then why did everyone else seem so convinced he wasn't real? Why was it that no one else could recall seeing him? It was as if he was invisible to everyone except me. The next time I saw him, I decided to approach him directly. I needed to get some answers. I crossed the street and walked right up to him, hoping he might speak, might acknowledge me in some way that would make sense of this strange situation. "Excuse me," I said, my voice slightly shaky. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" The man didn't react. He didn't even look at me. His gaze remained fixed on the street, and he stood so still, I could almost believe he wasn't breathing. I tried again, this time reaching out to touch his shoulder. As my fingers made contact with the fabric of his jacket, it felt like a wave of cold passed through me, as if I had touched something otherworldly. My heart skipped a beat, and I recoiled instinctively. Before I could gather my thoughts, he moved. He didn't speak a word, didn't make any gesture that suggested he had heard me. But as he turned away, I caught the faintest glimpse of his face. His features were nondescript, average even except for his eyes. They weren't right. They were dark, too dark, with no reflection, no life in them. And there was something about his expression. It was like he was looking through me, not at me. As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange compulsion to follow him. Something was pulling me toward him, like a magnetic force I couldn't ignore. I began walking after him, my feet moving of their own accord, even as my mind screamed for me to stop. He led me down a winding alley between two shops, a place I had never noticed before, though it was only a few blocks from where I lived. I followed him into the alley, the air growing colder as I went deeper into the shadowed path. But when I turned the corner, he was gone, vanished. There was no trace of him, no sign he had ever been there. The alley was just as empty as it had been before. But I knew something was wrong. I had felt it, had seen it, the way his gaze never reached me, the way he never seemed to interact with the world. It was as if he was walking through life like a ghost, drifting between the cracks of reality, too detached to truly belong. I went back to the cafe the next day, desperate for answers. I asked the owner, the barista, even the people who regularly came in, but nobody remembered seeing him. Nobody could recall his name, his face, or even the fact that he had been there the day before. It hit me then, with the full force of a cold, chilling realization. I was the only one who could see him. The more I dug into the strange presence of the man who wasn't really there, the deeper I sank into a web of dark secrets, buried histories, and unsettling truths that no one wanted to remember. It started innocently enough. Some whispers, a few hushed conversations, people avoiding certain areas of town. But as I pressed further, things began to unravel in a way that was far more horrifying than I could have imagined. I visited the town's library, hoping to find some trace of the stranger, something to explain why he felt so wrong. The librarian, an elderly woman who had been there for decades, was the first person who seemed willing to engage with me about the stranger. When I brought up his odd behavior, her face went pale. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, ensuring no one else was listening, before she spoke in a hushed whisper. "People don't talk about him," she said, her voice shaking. "They don't remember him because it's better that way." "Who is he?" I pressed, feeling a pit grow in my stomach. I had to know the truth. She shook her head. "He's part of something much older than this town, something that we all wish we could forget." I pushed for more, but she clammed up, refusing to say another word. It was clear that whatever had happened was something she was terrified of, and her silence only deepened my curiosity. That night, I scoured the old local archives, flipping through dusty, yellowed papers and newspaper clippings. The deeper I went, the more disturbing the records became. In the back of a long-forgotten file, I found a mention of a tragedy that had occurred many years ago. It was a story that the town had tried to bury, an event that no one spoke of. Years ago, before I was born, there had been a fire in a local building, a large warehouse near the edge of town. The fire had been devastating, destroying everything in its path. But the most horrifying detail in the clippings was that no one knew who the victims were. There were rumors that the fire had been set intentionally, that the building was used as a meeting place by a group of people no one dared to talk about. They were a secretive cult, practicing dark rituals in the heart of the town, feeding off the fears and memories of those around them. As I pieced the details together, something clicked. The stranger, this man who didn't seem to exist, who could never be remembered, was part of the same cult. Or rather, He was a manifestation of the tragedy, a being born from the collective fear and grief of the town, an entity that could exist only because of the memories that no one was willing to confront. The town had tried to forget what happened, but in doing so, they had inadvertently kept the man, this creature, alive. And every time someone saw him, every time someone tried to remember, he grew stronger. He thrived on the fear, on the suppression of the truth, on the unwillingness to face the past. I had to confront him. I knew that much. The more I uncovered, the more the man's presence made sense. He wasn't just a stranger. He was a nightmare tied to this place, a piece of the town's hidden sins, a creature born from the darkest corners of its history. But confronting him, well, that was easier said than done. The next day, I found myself walking toward the town square, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to see him again, had to confront him and demand answers. But as I approached the cafe where I had last seen him standing, I felt a chill sweep over me. It was the same coldness I'd felt the first time I'd tried to get close to him. The same eerie sense that he wasn't entirely there. He was standing outside again, watching the world go by, but this time, something was different. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something in them, recognition, a hunger. It was as if he knew I had been digging into the town's past, that I had uncovered the truth. My body froze as the weight of that realization settled over me. I took a step forward, but as I did, the world around me began to shift. The street lights flickered, the sounds of the town dimmed, and the air grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. The stranger's gaze locked on me, and his lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak. But before he could, something strange happened. The world seemed to blur, and I suddenly found myself standing at the edge of town, staring at the same street I had just left. The same buildings, the same signs, the same people moving about, except they were all different. They were out of sync, moving in slow motion, repeating the same actions over and over. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I was back at the square, but it was like nothing had changed. The stranger was still there, watching me, but now there was a dark grin on his face. I stumbled backward in shock, realizing the truth. I was stuck. The moment I had tried to confront him had thrown me into a time loop, a twisted cycle where everything repeated itself over and over again, trapped in a never-ending nightmare. No matter how many times I tried to leave, no matter how far I ran, I always ended up back in the same place, with the same faces, the same street, and the same unnerving presence of the stranger, watching me with that all-knowing smile. Time had stopped. The town had trapped me in its dark web, a prisoner to its forgotten sins, doomed to relive the same events as long as the creature continued to feed off our collective fear. It didn't matter how much I tried to escape, because the past and the truth would always pull me back. I had uncovered too much. I had awakened something that was never meant to be remembered. And now, I was part of the town's curse, a living part of the story that would never end. As I continued to walk through the loop, I couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger was still with me, waiting for me to make a move, to try to break free. But in the end, I knew the truth. There was no escaping. The town had already swallowed me whole, and I was nothing more than another piece of its dark history. I had become part of the very thing I had tried to understand. Story 3. The Missing Friend, a Reddit mystery unraveled. It started innocently enough, like many things do. A friend and I, both avid Reddit users, stumbled upon a post that piqued our curiosity, a challenge of sorts. It promised to reveal a dark truth about the digital age, a truth so unsettling that it had been hidden away for years. The challenge was simple. Visit a cursed location, take a video proving you were there, and upload it for others to see. The legend surrounding this challenge was that anyone who completed it would uncover a secret about the world, something buried deep in the digital shadows. At first, we laughed it off as one of those strange internet trends, nothing more than an excuse for people to test their courage and mess around. But as we delved deeper into the thread, the stories from others who had taken the challenge intrigued us. Most of them claimed to have experienced eerie sensations, odd glitches in their video uploads, and even unexplainable events after participating. Some said they had heard whispers in the background of their footage, while others spoke of strange symbols appearing in their videos, symbols that didn't exist in the real world. One user even claimed to have seen a figure standing behind them in their footage, a figure that wasn't there when they filmed the video. There was something strangely compelling about it, a mix of curiosity, excitement, and the ever-present draw of the unknown. I convinced my friend Mark to join me. He was always up for a thrill, and he didn't need much convincing. We packed our bags, grabbed our cameras, and set off to the location that was rumored to be cursed, a desolate, abandoned house deep in the woods. The house had been vacant for decades, and the stories surrounding it were darker than anything I could have imagined. According to urban legends, it was built on the site of a tragic event, and the souls of those who had suffered there were said to haunt the area. The journey to the house was long and filled with unease. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. We didn't talk much as we walked, both of us feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on us. The house loomed ahead, hidden behind a thicket of trees, its broken windows staring at us like hollow eyes. The air was thick with decay, the scent of mildew and rot hanging in the damp air. The house looked like something out of a nightmare, its once white walls now stained with the marks of time and neglect. We stood outside for a moment, staring at it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something unsettling about the place, something that felt wrong, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves. We began filming, documenting our every step as we made our way into the house. Inside, the air was heavy, the darkness almost suffocating. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled hastily in what looked like charcoal, fading over time, but still undeniably there. It felt as if the house itself was alive, a presence lurking just out of sight, watching our every move. I remember turning to Mark as we wandered deeper into the house. "This place is messed up," I said, trying to lighten the mood. But Mark didn't reply. He had stopped walking, his face pale, staring at something just beyond the threshold of a darkened room. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of the room, thick and oppressive. I shrugged it off, assuming he was just letting the eerie atmosphere get to him. "Come on, let's get the footage and get out of here," I said, motioning for him to keep moving. But Mark didn't budge. Then, something changed. The temperature dropped, and a strange chill swept through the room. I felt it too, an unsettling presence that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sounded distant and disembodied. It was so soft, so faint, that I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But Mark heard it too. His eyes widened in fear, and I saw him take a step back, looking as if he were about to turn and run. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart racing. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the far side of the room, where shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. I felt a pull, a compulsion to investigate, but I also felt an overwhelming dread creeping over me. My legs felt heavy, as if the house was trying to keep me in place, to prevent me from leaving. "Mark, let's go," I urged, but he was already moving toward the shadows, as if drawn by some invisible force. I tried to call out to him, but before I could speak, a loud crash echoed through the house. I whirled around to see Mark's camera lying on the floor, its lens cracked. But he was gone, vanished. Panic surged through me, my mind racing as I frantically searched the house for any sign of him. The whispering voices grew louder, now mingling with the sounds of something moving in the dark corners of the house. I called out to him, my voice trembling, but there was no answer, just the growing sense of something or someone watching me. I stumbled through the house, my breath shallow, my mind reeling. That's when I found his phone. It was lying on the floor, face down, the screen cracked. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. The screen flickered, and a new message appeared, a single line of text from Mark. "Don't look behind you." I spun around in terror, expecting to see him standing there, but the room was empty. No Mark, no sound, just the oppressive silence and the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The phone buzzed in my hand again, and this time the message was different. It was a link, one that led to a video file. My heart pounded as I clicked it open. The video was of the house, filmed from Mark's point of view. It was shaky, disorienting, but then I saw it. The shadows in the corners of the room moved. Someone was standing just out of sight. Mark's voice, trembling with fear, whispered, "It's coming for me." The video cut out abruptly. I dropped the phone, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. I knew deep down that Mark was gone. He had disappeared into the very shadows of the house, and whatever had taken him was still lurking, waiting. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, and that's when I realized the true horror of the situation. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was cursed, and it was hungry. Mark wasn't the first to disappear, and he wouldn't be the last. Whatever evil resided there thrived on those who dared to seek it out. And now, I was Mark too, forever linked to a mystery that I couldn't escape. I ran back to my car, but the road out of the woods seemed longer, darker, as though the trees were closing in on me. When I got home, I checked my phone, and my heart nearly stopped. The video had been uploaded to my account. I hadn't done it. Mark had. The very video I had just watched was now live, for the whole world to see. But there was one more thing. The video was time-stamped with the date of today. Yet in the background, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was a figure. It was me. I hadn't been alone when I ran from the house. And whatever was in those shadows was still with me. Days passed after Mark's disappearance, and the weight of the event was pressing down on me, suffocating every rational thought. I had told the authorities about Mark's sudden vanishing, but they were as clueless as I was. Their searches were half-hearted, just routine, a cursory attempt to brush off something that seemed beyond explanation. The house was in the middle of nowhere, after all, and no one cared about the strange rumors that had clung to it for decades. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just walk away from what had happened. I needed to know the truth, even if it meant confronting something I wasn't prepared for. The only place left to look was the house. Mark had gone in to uncover something, and I had to follow his path, no matter how terrifying it seemed. Armed with my phone and a flashlight, I made my way back to that forsaken place. The trees seemed thicker now, as if the forest itself was trying to keep me away. The path I'd once traveled so confidently felt longer and more oppressive, the air dense and heavy, as if it too carried the weight of something unspeakable. I reached the house, the dilapidated structure looming before me like a dark, silent sentinel. Its windows, broken and empty, stared at me with a hollow gaze, as though daring me to enter. I hesitated, staring up at the house. The last time I stood here, I had left with nothing but questions and a crippling fear. But this time, I couldn't turn back. I needed answers. I needed to find Mark, or at least understand what had happened to him. Inside, the house was just as I remembered, cold, oppressive, and filled with an unsettling quiet. The air smelled musty, and the walls still bore the strange symbols that had haunted my thoughts since I first saw them. But this time, something was different. The house felt alive, almost as if it recognized me. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, every rustle of the wind outside, made me feel as though I were being watched by something unseen. I began my search, moving through the room slowly, carefully. The floor was littered with debris, old furniture, and dust, but there was something new, something I hadn't noticed before. A trail of what appeared to be freshly disturbed dirt, leading up to a narrow door at the back of the house. It was almost as if someone had been here recently, dragging something across the floor. I swallowed hard, my heart thumping in my chest. This was it, the place where Mark had disappeared. And now, it was my turn to find the truth. I pushed open the door and descended into the basement. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and I could feel the temperature drop with each step. The basement was darker than the rest of the house, the only light coming from my flashlight, which flickered erratically. I scanned the room, my breath catching in my throat. The basement was much larger than I expected, filled with old crates and boxes. But it wasn't the clutter that made my skin crawl. It was the sense of something else down here, something waiting. My flashlight caught on something at the far corner of the room. It was a stack of old VHS tapes, seemingly out of place in this otherwise decaying space. My fingers trembled as I picked up the first one, the label unreadable. I brought it to the basement's old, dusty television set and plugged it in. The screen flickered to life, and the grainy video began to play. It was a man, another person who had taken the challenge, just like Mark. He was walking through the house, his camera shaking, his breath erratic. He stopped in front of the same symbols that Mark had filmed, his voice trembling as he spoke. What is this place?" he asked, his words barely audible. The camera shifted, catching the faintest movement in the shadows. "I can't be the only one seeing that, right?" The camera panned to the corner of the room, where a figure stood, barely visible, shrouded in darkness. It was impossible to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. The figure was tall, thin, and seemed to shimmer, as though it weren't fully part of the world. The man backed away, his camera shaking violently, but the figure didn't move. It was watching him, studying him, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The screen went black for a moment, and then the video resumed. The man was running now, his breath coming in frantic gasps. "I need to get out of here," he whispered, but the sound of footsteps echoed in the background, following him, growing louder and faster. The camera tilted, and then the figure appeared again, closer this time, right behind him. There was no time to react. The man screamed, his voice cut off abruptly as the screen went dark. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The man's fate had been sealed in that video, just as Mark's had. But what was that thing? That shadow? It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, not a person, not an animal. It was an entity, something beyond comprehension, feeding off the fear and confusion of those who dared to uncover its secrets. I clicked the next video, my fingers slick with sweat. The next few were eerily similar, each showing someone else who had been foolish enough to participate in the challenge. Each one filmed the house, the symbols, and the shadows that followed them. But none of them made it out. Their videos were all the same. Terrified, shaky footage, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. And then nothing. When the last video ended, I felt the weight of the house pressing in on me. I was no longer alone. The darkness in the corner of the basement shifted, and for the briefest of moments, I saw a flash of movement. A figure standing at the far end of the room, watching me. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and ran for the stairs. But as I reached the top, I felt something cold brush against my skin. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a weight on my chest, as though something invisible was pulling me back, holding me in place. I spun around, gasping for air, but there was no one behind me. The room was empty. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The presence in the house was closing in on me, its dark energy pressing against me from all sides. I stumbled backward, desperate to get away, but the house itself seemed to be shifting, the walls closing in. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A face. It was barely visible, hidden in the shadows, but its eyes gleamed with malice, watching me with a predatory hunger. I turned to run, but before I could take another step, everything went black. When I awoke, I was outside the house, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. I didn't remember how I had gotten there, or how much time had passed. But the one thing I knew was undeniable. I had seen it. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. As I stumbled away from the house, I checked my phone. There in the gallery was a new video. My heart stopped as I opened it. It was me. The camera shook as I filmed the basement. I was speaking in a low voice, but there was no sound. And in the background, that same figure. It was there again, but the worst part? The figure was no longer in the shadows. It was standing right behind me. The video ended, and I realized with chilling certainty that whatever had been hunting Mark was now hunting me. And it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. The dark screen of my laptop stared back at me as I sat there, feeling the weight of everything I had just read. The 3 stories, so disconnected at first, had somehow managed to carve a chilling path in my mind, linking themselves together in ways I couldn't quite explain. The tales of the cursed house, the missing friend, and the stranger who wasn't really there weren't isolated at all. They were all connected by something darker, something sinister that seemed to feed on our curiosity, on our desire to uncover the truth. Each of the stories had left me with more questions than answers. The stranger in the town wasn't human. He was something else, something tied to the town's ancient secrets, an entity that preyed on people's fears and memories. Mark, my friend, had disappeared in that house, and others before him had met the same fate. Their final moments, recorded in those grainy videos, revealed that the place had been a site of ancient rituals, a cursed ground that transformed anyone who dared enter. It was like a trap designed to lure people in with the promise of answers, only to ensnare them forever. As I thought about the stories, the words from the Reddit posts echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about these tales had reached out to me personally, that they weren't just stories. They were warnings. I had read them all with the same curiosity that had driven Mark to that house, that had led me to investigate the strange phenomenon in the first place. But now, I was starting to wonder if that curiosity had come with a price. I looked around my small, dimly lit apartment, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The stories had left a mark on me, a seed of doubt. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As I ran my fingers over the cold keys of my laptop, I noticed a subtle shift. The world around me felt different, heavier, as if the line between the stories and my reality had begun to blur. Could these supernatural forces really be reaching out to me? I had sought out the truth behind the mysteries, just like the people in the stories, and now I feared the cost of that knowledge. Were the horrors I had read about somehow following me? Was I next? The realization hit me hard. The stories I had read were more than just entertainment. They were a warning. The price of curiosity, of searching too deeply into things that weren't meant to be understood, was higher than I had ever imagined. In the world of urban legends and ghost stories, sometimes the greatest danger is the desire to know the truth. What if the things we seek out to uncover are waiting for us to come closer, to open the door, to ask the wrong question? The threads of these stories intertwined, revealing a common thread, a dark, hidden force that thrived on human fear, that manipulated us with our own need for answers. It wasn't just in the stories, it was everywhere. And now, I couldn't ignore the fact that the shadows seemed to be creeping closer to me. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and it was only a matter of time before the things I had read about began to find their way to me. There was no escaping it now. Curiosity had led me here, and it would be curiosity that would likely be my undoing. In the end, I had learned the most unsettling truth of all. Some things are better left unexplored. Some questions are best left unasked. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted from hours of reading and reflecting. The clock ticked quietly in the background, its rhythmic sound almost soothing, if not for the ever-present tension in the air. I glanced at the screen, noticing the time. It was late past midnight, when everything seems quieter, emptier. But as I prepared to close the laptop, there was a faint sound that interrupted my thoughts. A knock. Soft, deliberate, almost hesitant. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't been expecting anyone. Who could it be at this hour? I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The stories I had just read flashed in my mind. The knocking, the unsettling silence, the presence that never truly left. I tried to brush it off, but a deep, unsettling feeling stirred in my chest. Slowly, I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I walked cautiously toward the door, my heart pounding. As I approached, I could feel the air growing colder, thicker. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a strange scraping sound, as if something or someone was shifting just beyond the door. I hesitated before peering through the peephole, but there was nothing, just the empty hallway outside. No one. My heart raced as I opened the door, my hand trembling on the handle. The hallway was empty. No sign of anyone, no footsteps leading away, just the same silence that had filled my apartment. I stepped outside, closing the door softly behind me, the cold air biting in my skin. My eyes scanned the empty hall, but there was no one. No movement, no shadows, just the silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. But then I saw it, a figure, faint, as if out of the corner of my eye. It crossed the hallway in a flash of shadow, moving too fast to catch clearly. My breath caught, and I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I had just missed something, someone, but there was no denying it. The door had knocked, the shadow had passed, and I had opened it. And now, I wasn't alone. As I sat back down, the weight of everything, my search for the truth, the things I had uncovered, pressed on me, suffocating me. Was I becoming part of one of these stories? The line between the narrator and the story had already started to blur. What if I was never meant to uncover the truth? What if everything I had read, everything I had written, had been leading to this moment? I glanced at my laptop again, a chill creeping up my spine. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I couldn't help myself. I typed a few words, a sentence that I hadn't planned to write, but it felt necessary. It felt like the only way to understand what was happening. I thought I was safe, but now I know the stories are real, and I am a part of them. I pressed send, unsure of who or what might be reading. And as I leaned back, feeling the weight of the words I had just written, I realized with a start, the story might not have ended at all. Maybe it was just beginning.